Researchers have found that we have a strange relationship with who we are becoming. We treat our future self as if they were a stranger. Perhaps it's because our future self is in many ways unknowable that we avoid thinking about them. But the cost of this avoidance is that we don't always look after our long-term interests, or of those that we care about who will rely on our future selves. Psychologists have found that the most powerful way to develop our relationship with who we are becoming is to enter a two-way dialogue. So rather than just thinking about what your future self wants, we should also be asking, what does our future self want from us now? In this show, we talk to the psychology researcher, Professor Hal Hershfield, about what he's discovering about creating a relationship with our future selves that can help us to be happier, healthier, and more successful, both now and in the future. Tune in to an important conversation on The Evolving Leader.
Hi friends, welcome to The Evolving Leader, the show born out of the belief that we need deeper, more accountable, and more human leadership to confront the world's biggest challenges. I'm Scott Allender.
And I'm John Gomes.
How are you feeling on this Friday, Mr. Gomes?
Well, honestly, I am feeling very depleted. I have just got off a plane from the US. I was near the Blue Ridge Mountains, which was beautiful. But it was a flying visit. I was in and out, and I did a lot of travel to get there via Madrid and all sorts of things, thanks to last-minute cancellations by an unnamed airline, which we won't talk about. But other than that, I'm feeling very good. So a bit physically depleted, but I've been looking forward to this conversation for the best part of a year. It was taking us that long to track down our guest, pin him down, and finally extract some time from him. So we're really grateful for that. So yeah, how are you feeling, Scott?
I'm feeling in awe of you and your ability to do these sort of like overnight international travel for a gig. What is your present self, which used to be your future self? What is it saying to your past self about your choice to do that trip?
My future self is furious with my past self, and it's going to have a serious talking to him. But of course, they don't talk. That's the problem.
I feel that problem myself, and we're going to get into that. I'm feeling eager today because, like you said, we've been anxious to talk to this guest for a while. We both love his book. Today, we are joined by Professor Hal Hershfield, who has gotten us both thinking differently about who we're becoming as leaders, having read his book, as I just mentioned. Hal is a professor of marketing, behavioral decision-making, and psychology at UCLA's Anderson School of Management and holds the UCLA Anderson Board of Advisors term chair in management. His research, which sits at the intersection of psychology and economics, examines the ways we can improve our long-term thinking and decision. He's been widely published in academic journals and popular media, and on top of his research, he consults with major financial and marketing clients. Hershfield was named one of the 40 most outstanding business school professors under 40 in the world by business education website Poets and Quartz, and his book, as I keep mentioning, Your Future Self, How to Make Tomorrow Better Today, was described by Daniel Pink as the rare book that will change who you see in the mirror, which, as I understand, really upset the people over at Botox, but we can talk about that too. Hal, welcome to The Evolving Leader.
I think there's a collaboration that could be done with those Botox folks, but Scott and John, thanks so much for having me. I've been really looking forward to this conversation.
Welcome to The Evolving Leader, Hal. How are you feeling today?
Yeah, thanks for asking. If I'm going to be honest, a little bit physically tired. My wife had a dinner at 6:30 last night with a group of friends she hasn't seen in a while, and she came home at around 12:15 and causing me to text her and ask her, "Did you leave the state?" I've never seen a dinner last this long. So, but you know what? I'm here. I've had coffee. I'm ready to go. I'm excited to talk to you guys.
Well, good for your wife. I'm sure she had a wonderful time.
Yeah.
So, So at the heart of this book that you've just written is the idea that our future self is a stranger to us, and that has a range of significant implications for our decision making, our well-being, and the quality of the lives, full stop. Can we set the stage for this conversation by unpacking this idea a little bit and why this became the focus of your work?
Yeah. I'll start with the second part of that. The reason why it became the focus of my work, I mean, dates back, gosh, over 15 years ago, around the time of the great financial crisis, and trying to understand why it might be the case, why so many people made decisions that had a lot of reward in the present, but could come back to to uh, to to create potential harm later on, right? So why do I sign up for a mortgage that I'm never going to be able to keep up? Why, as a lender, do I lend out money when I know that this is probably not the right idea? And none of these things are surprising because there's so many tensions and pulls on the present moment right there. But I was trying to go deeper and understand, like, what is it about our psychology that makes thinking about the consequences of now later so difficult? That was really the impetus there. And from there I started realizing, man, there's so many decisions that involve trade-offs between the now and later, the present and the future, that go way beyond the financial, but they have to do with leadership and how I think about allocating my time and how I think about ethics and my health and all of these sorts of things that involve these sort of now later decisions. So that was really like how I got into this space.
Mm. And so can we just unpack the idea of that being a stranger to yourself, your future self?
Yeah, in a nutshell, the basic idea here is that one of the reasons that a lot of these present and future decisions are so difficult is because we often think of our future self as if it's another person. And that has some real implications when you start thinking about the way that we treat other people in our lives. In other words, there are a range of people that we interact with. Some of them are almost complete strangers. Like, we might know them. Like, I know, there's like, I'm just thinking now about like another parent I know from my kid's school. Like, I know their name, but I know nothing about them. I don't know their hobbies. I don't know anything about their personality, except for the fact that we're very loosely connected because our kids go to the same school. And if that, like, I'm just thinking about this one particular dad, if he were to like shoot me a text right now and say, like, I'm in a bind, I need some help this weekend because I don't know, there's been some mold in my garage and I need to move stuff out of it. I'd be like, first off, it'd be a little strange. I think there's no one else you can text. And secondly, I'd probably say no. And not because I'm such a bad person, but because I have so many other things going on this weekend. And the reason I think that little imaginary anecdote is important is because if we think of our future selves the same way, if they're like that sort of stranger who we know they exist, but we have no real emotional bond to them, then doing things for their benefit, making these decisions that may end up helping them later on, feels almost strange and irrational, right? So I think that's kind of at the heart of it. Now, the caveat here is that there are a lot of people who, if they texted me right now to ask them, to ask me for help this weekend, I would maybe begrudgingly say yes to, right?
Yeah.
It's like, whether it's like a best friend or, a relative, or of course, like if my kids or my wife, any of these people ask me to do something, I would drop what I have planned and do something for them. Now, I don't mean to say that every decision between now and later has to involve this like painful sacrifice. But on some level, whenever we decide to not do something so that we have more of something else later, there is a little bit of a sacrifice there, and there is a little bit of that. Okay, I'll do something now for you later, right? And I'm sure we'll get into the nuances of that because it's really not black and white. But I think at the heart of the matter, we sometimes think of our future selves as if they're other people, and what matters is the type of person that future self is. And the relationship that we have with that version of us.
I want to get into those details. I want to look at some of your research and examples in the books. I loved one of the experiments with the gross drink that you talked about and what people did with that. But you start the book with the question, are we the same over time? And you point out a really interesting way of answering that question by identifying when those closest to us might say they no longer recognize us. And that's usually connected to some sort of evolution of our moral traits, right? So if something about our moral traits have fundamentally altered. Can maybe we start there?
Yeah, so I I find this question, by the way, I feel like this could be one of those questions that you stay up super late at night with a bottle of wine or maybe more, debating like who am I? And am I the same person that I once was? I'm in my mid 40s now, and I know we've just met, by the looks of it, you guys are mid 30s, right? We'll say. I'm just kidding.
Wow.
Hal, are you going to ask her a
Sorry, it's
favor
too easy.
later on this weekend? Is that what you're doing?
I'm getting paid for this, right? By the looks of it, we're in the same boat. And, it's funny because, I'm having now this experience of connecting with friends who I first connected with sometimes upwards of 25 years ago, sometimes even more if they're from childhood. And it's this funny question of like, what binds us and are we the same? And, the research on this is fascinating. And so much of the really interesting stuff has been done by Nina Strominger at Penn. And the thing that her work really points to is that when we make these sorts of judgments, which are really difficult, by the way, but when we make these judgments about, are we the same or not? One of the things that we're really sort of fundamentally thinking about is moral character. And things like your interests could change, and of course where you live, and of course how you look. But the things that are defining in a moral way is your sense of humor biting, or is it more gentle? Are you the type of person who is typically compassionate, or do you have like sort of an edge? And it's not like a positive negative thing, but like, what are those things that have been present as a hallmark of your sort of moral character? And if those things change, that's when we start saying that person is no longer really the person who I once knew. Or, I never really knew him, did I? Right. And I think these questions are important for this broader conversation we're having, because I think at the heart of it is this overarching sort of curiosity of, well, if it's possible that we change so much over time or don't change over time, what should we be doing now for the benefit or, detriment of some future version of ourselves? And I think these get to be, they're deeply philosophical questions, and sometimes they're hard to answer. But I really love this idea of sort of pointing to sort of morality as one binding factor here.
So I was really interested in the research where you're looking at the cost analysis that people are making. So, a young man who's a teenager smoking doesn't think about the costs at, 50, 60 into their health. What's going on in people's minds when they're looking at behaviors that undermine their future self? How are they looking at the calculation?
So in some cases, I think they're not, right? I think, we have to acknowledge at the outset that, if you take a 15-year-old making that decision, I'm not sure it's even a calculation, right? And so, one of the things I talk about in the book is that sometimes we are so weighted down by the present that we almost just miss the future entirely. It's like driving where there's so much fog ahead that we can't even see where we're going. But it's more than that. It's like we didn't even decide where to go. We're just somehow driving, right? So I think you have to acknowledge that in some cases there is no calculation. But that can't be all of it, right? I think there are other times where when making a decision that could harm us later, we are making a calculation, but the calculation is one of the benefits I'm experiencing now from doing this thing far outweigh whatever I perceive the cost to be. Most likely because I'm really underweighting those costs, right? I'm not thinking about the risks involved with whether it's smoking or engaging in some other risky behavior or not, not saving at the rate that someone tells me to if I can save at that rate, and I think there's a lot of different examples here. Another factor that I think could be involved here is that there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the future. And by the way, this is an anecdotal observation, but I suspect that our perceptions of future uncertainty have increased in recent years. That with COVID and various global events and whatnot, it's certainly, and one of the things that I'm hearing, and I'm as a researcher, I'm very hesitant to say, well, I hear this, so this is just anecdotal. When I talk to younger people, when I talk to my younger students, I hear something that I hadn't heard when I first started this research, which is, why should I think about the future? Why should I plan for the future when there's just no guarantee at all what things will look like? And that is, that's hard to grapple with. That's a really hard thing to grapple with.
Well, I mentioned at the onset with John's trip and the joke around sort of his future self. Is he okay with the decision to have made this long journey on no sleep? And then your even example about, staying up with a bottle of wine and talking and waxing poetic about ourselves could be a decision where the next morning we go, gosh, I'm groggy from having done that. And I love that you have so many of these real examples. It really brings it to life. And one of the things I really focused on was the language people use about themselves. You talk to us about when people use first person descriptions of themselves, and then when it sort of shifts into third person description.
Yeah, there's some great research. Emily Pronin at Princeton was the one who started a lot of this work, but other folks have done it as well, where in that particular work, they ask college students to, write down a little narrative of, something like a meal this year or a birthday this year. And you can imagine the types of things people write down. They say, okay, I'm sitting here. I see my friends nearby. I've got a drink in front of me. I'm eating some food. It's like the very, very much the description that you would give me right now about a meal that you might have later tonight or tomorrow or whatever. But then she does something interesting. She says to a different group of people, give me it's the same narrative. Tell me about a meal or a birthday in the very distant future. Which, as a side note for undergrads, is anytime over 40, which I actually was surprised. I thought they would say like 25, this very distant future, right? But okay, over 40. And one of the things that these researchers find is that there's a shift that happens where not everybody, but significantly more people end up talking about their future selves using the third person. So rather than saying, okay, I'm sitting there, I see friends, they'll say, yeah, I see my future self there. I see him there. He's sitting there. He's got his friends around him, and it's like a very subtle thing, but it's it's deep. It's meaningful because it suggests that in some ways, in the mind's eye, our future selves look like other people. And I think that's a fascinating demonstration of this concept that we were talking about a little while ago.
So interesting.
Yeah, so this kind of notion that you say, in the real way, our future self is sort of unknowable to us. How do we change that relationship? How do we move past being the stranger and move into a different type of relationship?
I think it's a great question. By the way, I'll say, I think we've started off this conversation with a lot of things that could be seen as pessimistic or negative. We changed. We're different. We're strangers. The future is uncertain. And at the same time, I like almost want to shout that I'm like really hopeful and positive and optimistic about the way that people can relate to their future selves. Right. And I think, your question is a practical one. Like, how can we change that relationship? One of my favorite tools for doing it is, that is, when I say doing it, that is changing that relationship, is simply starting a conversation with that future self And I think, there's something hokey about that,
Mm.
admittedly, but I have now read, and conducted a lot of the research as well. And one of the things that I really love is a letter writing conversation, or I say letter writing, by the way, and something about the concept of writing a letter feels antiquated. So I almost want to say, like a text conversation or whatever it is with your future self. But importantly, for the exercise to work, what you want to do is write a letter to some future self, and then take the perspective of that future self and write a letter
Mm.
back. And the reason why that's such a nice exercise is it forces you to take the perspective of some distant version of yourself, whatever that, whether it's 5 years, 10 years down the line, 15 years, excuse me, whatever it might be. And I think it needs to be acknowledged. We can never know our future selves. Like we keep talking about this analogy of the future self as another person, which I think is such a powerful analogy, but it's not totally accurate because whereas my best friend is another person, my wife is another person, and I can take her perspective and I can try to imagine a conversation with her, but then I can actually go and have one. I can never go and have a conversation with my future self because definitionally he doesn't yet exist. Um, I actually, by the way, I've been working with some folks at MIT to develop an AI tool to like actually allow people to mimic that
Oh, wow.
conversation, where you're writing back and forth, and it's only as good as your ability to lose yourself in the exercise and recognize that. Of course, I'm not talking to my real future self, but it's a proxy for it. I think talking to older, I'll call it role models, but older proxies for our future selves, older surrogates for our future selves is another good way to start that conversation and get closer to those future selves. But at the heart of it, a lot of this work is all about making the future self and the future context more vivid, because it's really easy. No, there's nobody who is surprised that there is a future, right? We're so lucky. We're so fortunate in many contexts, especially in, you know, call it sort of, I don't want to say just westernized, but I think in many fortunate contexts, there's cases where there's some certainty around the future, right? We most of us expect to wake up tomorrow. That being said, when we push things out further, the future just can become very abstract and we don't think about it deeply. And these sorts of exercises, I think what they do is can provide some color and some concreteness and some vividness to that future. And then this is, by the way, this is an exercise that's enormously useful in leadership as well. There's some work that was done on leaders, having them imagine that they were essentially traveled in a time travel machine to the future and, write a letter back. And what does that letter look like? And the leaders who do that and then write correspondence to their employees end up writing more detailed and vivid, sort of like state of the company type correspondence, which I think is a really fascinating translation of this work, not just for our own selves, but to ourselves as leaders in business contexts as well.
In having this dialogue, you've also learned what doesn't work to make this conversation really productive. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the things that you've seen there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's funny because I haven't done as much, as researchers, we look for the things that do work, and often and I think this is a failure. We don't do the work on like what doesn't work. I used to think that simply writing to a future self was the thing that worked. And I do have some research that shows that there's an impact of that. But the recent research suggests that that's far less effective than doing the sort of two-way conversation. So I don't think that is as useful. I don't think that simply imagining the future is as useful as having a conversation, but a guided induction where we're actually like sitting down and really thinking deeply about visualizing the future is something that's more useful than sitting down and sort of just kind of imagining. One of the other things that other researchers have found, which I think is fascinating, is that simply fantasizing about the future doesn't do much for our motivation. And it's ironic because there's something very positive about, sitting back and imagining any number of positive outcomes, whether it's in my personal life, in my professional life, when I think about retirement. But ironically, what these researchers have found is that when you end up positively fantasizing about the future, and this is Gabrielle Oettingen at NYU, what she's found is that you get some energy from doing so. You get some utility, like to use an economist term, but then that doesn't translate into you getting up and doing something. It's like you feel good about it. You sit back, you have that sort of like fantasized, idealized image of the future, and then you go about your day and you don't make a change. And one of the ways that she's found that you can rectify this is by engaging in an exercise called mental contrasting, where you do fantasize about the future. Like, don't stop doing that. But then contrast your idealized vision of the future with your realistic reality of right now. And think about the obstacles, the overcomable obstacles between now and later, so that you can try to figure out, okay, what are the small steps I need to take to get at least somewhere near that positive image of the future. And by the way, John, I think one of the reasons why that insight is important is because I think a lot of people have the intuition that one way to motivate people is to get them to think really positively, about the future. And I'm not saying don't, but I'm adding a ingredient in there, which is that contrast between now and later as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. And when you use the word fantasy, I think that brings home a lot of meaning in here, which is it's almost like a displacement from the present. You're not actually sitting in the future. You're trying to offset, whatever you're experiencing right now, and it can feel fun to do that, but actually it isn't moving you into any form of action.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
How much does making our future selves more familiar to us depend on making our present selves more familiar to us? I'm looking at this from a lens of self-awareness, because there's a lot of research out there that would suggest that often we're not very self-aware of our current selves, right? And I'm just wondering if you saw a correlation between the amount of self-awareness somebody possesses today and their ability to imagine and connect with a more familiar future self.
Scott, that is such an interesting question. Well, can I just put it back to you for a second? Like, is this something you've noticed in your own work in terms of trying to make any changes?
Yeah, so if long-term listeners would know this, that I'm an Enneagram guy. I use that system to try to help people understand what is often latent or unconscious motivations. And, when I coach people, there's usually a lot of aha moments where they go, gosh, I didn't even know that's why I saw these things the way I see them. I didn't know that's why I get triggered by this thing, right? There's a lot of like moments where people go, like I've been living the last 40, 50 years not even aware of why I felt and saw and acted certain ways. And so I was just curious, if that's happening in the present, I'm wondering if there's a correlation to the ability to connect and imagine a more familiar future.
I love that. I love that concept. From a research standpoint, it's not something that, to the best of my, so I haven't investigated it. I don't know that others have as well. If I were to take my researcher hat off and just think through it, it certainly makes a lot of sense. It like passes the smell test, right? Because there has been recent work that's looked at this idea of connecting to our future selves, but not just connecting to our future selves, connecting to them because we have more what these researchers call self-certainty. We have more of a sense of what are the certain aspects of ourselves and what will remain sort of certain over time. That's sort of, tangentially related to your question there, which is, I think, if I can have a sense of who I am now, it's certainly a lot easier to anchor onto that to try to project who I might be in the future. And, one of the exercises that we often do is ask people how similar do they think they'll be to their future selves in terms of their likes, their dislikes, their ideals, their values, their personality, their all this sort of bundle, their ideals, all of these sorts of things that represent sort of a picture of who someone is. But fundamental to that is also having some awareness of what my likes, dislikes, ideals, values,
Mm-hmm.
personality, etc., are right now. And
Right.
if that's very, very fuzzy, then I would imagine it would be hard to project that into the
Mm.
future. But from like a strictly empirical sense, that's not something I've looked at. Though, man, I want to like go call up some of my PhD students right now and be like, look, we've got to do this. This is a great, important question.
Yeah, and we'd love to hear, kind of like what happens when you have that
Yeah.
conversation. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Do you guys have some funding for the
that's the second time you've asked for money, Hal, in this show. It's just like,
I now realize that as I said that, I said, "Oh shit, I can't make the same joke twice." Okay, good,
oh,
good,
it's a
good.
joke.
Different
Okay, as
types of
long as
money.
it's a joke.
Third time will be real.
It's your pitching strategy to fund the lab. I can see it. It's working. Um,
Yeah, exactly.
we're talking about trying to envision some sort of picture of our future self so that we can change the relationship from the complete stranger where you don't have any empathy or relationship and emotional kind of bond. But you talk about the fact that there's a rocky road to close that gap. And you also talk about commitment devices that help us to look after the interests of our future self. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite topics to look at and research and investigate. And here's the basic idea. We've been talking about sort of present and future selves as these two things, but it's really, I don't want to overcomplicate it, but it's certainly more than that because there's some present version of me right now. And then there's some like, let's call it some like, cumulative or eventual future self, let's call it me at age, 65. And I have some vision of how I want that version of my life to be. But then there's all these other little things along the way, right? There's all these other little future selves along the way. And by the way, I could have a goal right now that I want to, get into shape to run the LA Marathon in 6 months. Now, that's a 6 month future self. That version of me may lead up to a future self at 65. And there may be little steps along the way that are going to necessitate that I do the things I need to do to get to the version of me in 6 months and in 20 years and whatever it is. And those are the things that can be really hard to grapple with. So specifically, I need to wake up tomorrow morning and run a certain number of miles so that I get in shape to actually do the marathon. If I could, this is now the first time I'm publicly mentioning this, so it's like going to have to happen, right?
It's a commitment now.
That's it. Speaking of commitment
Well,
devices,
we could be your commitment device, Hal, and just
yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. I think probably a lot of people recognize that the present version of me wants to say that I've done a marathon and I want 6 months from now to have done it. That future guy, I think his interests are very much aligned with mine. I think he wants to run that marathon. It's not him I'm worried about. It's me tomorrow morning. That's the guy I'm worried about because it'll be Saturday morning and I'm probably going to be tired from the week and I don't know if I'll be able to get up and actually throw on my running shoes and go outside and take an hour long run or whatever it is. And it's that one that I have to sort of help out. And the idea that economists and psychologists have come up with, it's called a commitment device or a pre-commitment device. And the idea is that you constrain some potentially undesirable behavior. Now, I think there's versions of this that we've all done, right? So, I think a lot of people know the idea of putting out your workout clothes, reducing whatever amount of friction, putting my alarm across the room. Well, these are, I think, sort of basic things. There's a whole menu of commitment devices that range from very, very light. So, for instance, telling myself I'll get up and run to very, very punitive. If I don't run, I'm going to have to owe $500 to a group I don't want to give money to, an anti-charity. I won't go political. I'll call it like the sports program at USC, our crosstown rival in LA. Okay, just to keep it
Above board.
to keep it diplomatic here. Yeah. Now the issue is here's the irony with these commitment devices. The stronger that they are, the more effective they are, right? So if it's the, if there's an like if I could set things up so that if I don't get out of bed, $500 automatically gets charged to my credit card to an anti-charity, you better believe I'm going to figure out a way to get out of bed, right? If I simply tell myself that I'm going to do it, or I tell my wife I'm going to get up, and I go against that, like, oh, okay, I didn't follow through on my word. It's not that painful. So the problem here is that the most sort of punitive ones are the most effective, but they're also the least likely to get adopted. Because, I think people on some level recognize that there's a chance that I'll mess up, and I don't want to have to get punished there. So I'm actually doing a lot of work right now with one of my students, Megan Weber, and collaborator Craig Fox, and we're trying to figure out how do we get people to actually start adopting these commitment devices, because we know they're really powerful. One of the, I'll give you one quick insight that we've had, which is we're trying to remind people that the obstacles they've faced in the past will certainly still be there in the future. And we all have a tendency to think optimistically that somehow this future version of me is going to be the guy who was like able to wake up and go on a run, or happily able to, not order the dessert, and happily able to do whatever the thing is that I think, he should do. And in reality that, we never really become that guy. Right? And I don't want to say, like, I'm not trying to say that's like again, I'm not trying to be pessimistic about ourselves, but I think it's a realistic thing that, like, situations are really powerful. We get tired. We get hungry. We put ourselves in context where we're likely to succumb to the thing that we don't want to succumb to. And recognizing that, I think, is what gives me optimism and hope that, there are a lot of barriers we face. And the barriers that made it really hard for me to get through my to-do list on time last month are going to be the same barriers that are going to make it hard for me to get through my to-do list next month. And knowing that, what things can I put into place, right? Recently, by the way, I've had this same realization with social media, where I know that the benefits I get from it are far outweighed by the costs. I feel like I'm on my phone too much. I don't feel like I'm getting positive utility from sort of mindlessly scrolling through. I feel like I've ignored my kids. And I'll tell myself I want to stop going on Instagram. I might tell my wife, I think we should model better behavior. We should do this, right? But the thing that's worked recently is I downloaded an app called OneSec, and you basically link it to the apps that you are sort of mindlessly going to. And it does something really simple. It adds 15 seconds to your ability to get into the app, and it shakes your phone a little bit. It's like a wake-up call. And then it says, take a deep breath. And then it goes, do you want to continue on to Instagram or not? And the no is big and the yes is little. And if you click yes,
what's that called again?
It's called OneSec.
Because I want to put that on my wife's Amazon.
Oh God! Seriously. That's very funny. You can use it for any app. And by the way, then it does this funny thing where if you say yes, there's still another screen you have to go through, and it asks you why. And it's like, I'm bored, I'm angry, I'm on the toilet is one of the options, right? And
the data is collecting
so
on you.
The data
it's
John, you're on the toilet far too often.
I give it all of that data. And you know what the funniest thing is, it forced me to realize how often I mindlessly do something that I say, I'm the guy who doesn't want to be on Instagram. Tomorrow me wants to say I didn't do it yesterday. And then, I found myself literally walking from the dining room table to the toaster in the kitchen to get my kids toast. And I'm like, well, I have a half a second. And it's like, I don't need to go on this now. And it's far reduced my time on it. Now, have I gone on other apps instead? Probably a little bit, but maybe more like productive ones, like the New York Times or something like that, right? So it's, I think it's the principle here is recognizing that we need help with our behavior, and that's okay. And it's those little rocky road, the rocky bumps that we can smooth out by putting some constraints on potentially undesirable future behavior.
My tendency is when I start imagining a better future self is I have too many of those things I try to take on at one time. I sent John a list of, on my last birthday, I sent John a list of like 15 things I was going to do, right? And guess how many of them I've done?
14,
I think maybe 4.
14?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I wish.
I know there's like a joke in there too, but I think there's wonderful research on setting, what we call like a goal range, where I love the idea of saying, well, how about if I just tackle one of these things and at best 3 of these things, right? Or you can get more literal and, I want to run anywhere from 4 miles a week to 12 miles a week, right? And the nice thing about that is that the low end is achievable. But if it becomes too easy, then I have something else I can work toward to keep me motivated, right? But I worry about like the 15. I love that. My father-in-law, by the way, does the same thing every year. He has this list, and it's like, and I'm like, are you really going to tackle all of those things, right? But I also, I love the idea of like, what's the one thing? What's just the one thing I can do to make it as simple as possible? And think about the counterfactual of what will change in my life if I do that one thing, right? So, I've been exploring the idea of trying to motivate people to take more steps by simply saying, like, if you simply take X number more steps per day, these are people who are sedentary. It could add, however many years of healthy life to your life, right? Not just like extra years, but like health span, right? Where we're talking about like actually feeling good, right? So I think it's good to think, to keep it, you can think small, but then also give yourself a range so that like you get challenged as well.
If the conversations we've been having on The Evolving Leader have helped you in any way, please head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. Thank you for listening. Now let's get back to the conversation.
So can we shift the focus of the conversation a bit from our individual relationship with our future self to the implications on the economy and society? For example, you looked at the implications on the growing percentage of American workers who have become freelancers and therefore responsible for their own retirement savings. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is actually a hot topic right now in behavioral economics, where there's essentially the individual and then there's society, or you can call it policymakers. And at least, I'll give you like the example of the American model of retirement savings, which was that for the longest time, workers were on pensions. Part of my pay package was that my company was setting aside money for me that would then get put into a pot. And when I retired, I would get essentially an annuity. I would get paid out until I died, which is a great model until you start recognizing that people are switching companies all the time. People are living longer than expected, and it becomes hard to sustain. And also, it doesn't leave that much choice to the worker. So then there's this shift toward what you call defined contribution plans, where workers now get to set how much do I contribute, how do I allocate that portfolio, and I can take that money with me if I move jobs, which is, of course, much more common now than it was 40 years ago, 50 years ago. The issue is that now you've put all of the onus on the worker. And I think the debate that's happening in behavioral economics at the moment is when we come up with solutions that individuals can implement themselves, aren't we implicitly saying that everything is the worker's problem or the individual's problem? And might it be better to think about the mixture that can occur in terms of some solutions could be state, at the state level or at the company level, and some solutions might be at the individual level. And I think there's, that sort of moderate position is one that I really gravitate toward, because I think it really is quite difficult, to ask somebody, especially who's 22 and starting working, hey, how do you want to allocate your portfolio? How much do you want to set aside? Well, God, that's not for so long, right? And it's like, it's easy to imagine why, like, you need more right now. And sometimes you do, by the way. But I think that sort of juxtaposition between putting the responsibility on the worker and then spreading it out over society and over companies is one that I would bet we're going to start seeing more conversation around within the field of behavioral economics. And of course, it's, at the policy level as well.
So one of the things that comes to mind in this conversation, as people listening in who are parents might be thinking, how can I help my children? How can I help Gen Z and younger use this future self thinking to not become beaten down by the uncertainty of AI and so on? How can they use it in a constructive way? What advice would you give to parents?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things at play here. So one is, look, we can't ignore the power of modeling, right? So, if the parent is a representation of the child's future self, give them something to look forward to, right? The other one I think is you can't wash away reality, and I think the reality is that there is a lot of uncertainty, and what will the jobscape look like? How will AI impact my life for the better and for the worse? And at the same time, I think we need to have the conversation that this isn't the first time in history where the future has been uncertain, and it will arrive. And, one way to make it brighter is to do some things now to put ourselves in a better position for later. But at the same time, I think it also the conversation needs to be had around living in the present too. And that, this is something that I think our children and especially teenagers have no problem doing. But where I think the problem arises is the balance between present and future. And that so often the conversation around taking care of the future takes the flavor of you really need to stop doing these sorts of things that lean into today and spend more time sacrificing for the future. And I think there's a problem there because it's almost like saying, stop eating dessert. I'm not going to do that, right? But the moderate sort of harmony or balance position of sometimes it makes sense to do the thing that may not be the right decision for the future, but it is right for now. That's okay. But if you do that all the time, then you have a bleaker future. But if all the time you're like, okay, I'm going to stay in and steady, you also have a bleaker future because in some ways you've robbed yourself of some of the memories. You've robbed your future self of some of the memories that could be created right now. So what I really like the idea of is having just a more of a real, honest, authentic conversation around creating balance between now and later, and when it makes sense to lean in and do the thing now, and when it makes sense to take a step back and do the thing that might be good for the future. And again, this is my non-researcher hat, but my suspicion is that starting that conversation early will be a good thing to see how that plays out later on in life when as a late adolescent or as a college student or as a young worker or young adult worker, you do have some real decisions about now and later. And if you always do one or the other, I think it's a less positive picture than if you figure out how to balance or harmonize between the present and the future.
There's so many more questions I have. We're running out of time. So we have a diverse group of leaders listening all over the world. Maybe what's one piece of practical homework? You've given us so much practical insight, but what's one challenge you might leave a listener with to go put into practice straight away?
Yeah, I love that. I love that question, Scott. Let me answer it 2 ways. I would say really concretely, I really like, and I want to support the idea of a letter writing exercise. And I'll add a layer to that, which is write a letter to your past self as well, to grease the wheels of this sort of time travel I'm having you think about. But then as a second order, I would say, ask yourself the deep question of not only how do I want the future to look, but how do I want the present to look in relation to that future? And where do I see that balance happening? We started by talking about John's trip and sort of the craziness of going overnight travel international. And what I love about that example is you can look at it so many ways. Is that bad for today's self? I don't know. Maybe you're tired today, but overall, I think that sort of experience leads to a richness in your life, right? Yeah. Now, that said, if you did that all the time, you might burn out, right? So it's like, what's that, so then, sorry, here's the second practical thing. Take the bird's eye perspective and stop asking the question of, if I should do something, but rather when should I do something and when should I not do something? So it's, should I travel or not? That's a hard question to ask. When should I take these sort of crazy overnight, trips internationally? How many of them per year should I take? And when should I not? When should I be home? That then creates a perspective that isn't so myopic, but rather takes the 10,000 foot view so you can see where all the different puzzle pieces fit together.
Yeah.
That's so good. That's so good. Thank you for joining us today, folks. If you haven't read Your Future Self yet, make sure you get a copy straight away. This is filled with so much good research, and it's so easy to read, and it's conversational, and it's filled with stories, and it's engaging the whole way through. So you've done a really great service to the world with this book, Hal. Thank you so much. And until next time, folks, remember, the world is evolving. Are you?